Started. Again, just a quick introduction. My name is Beth Peck. I work for the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. I am part of the application development team for DR 4480, the funding opportunity that we're going to talk about today. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Unfortunately, we do not have an exact date that that'll happen, but just kind of keep an eye out. We'll make sure that it gets up there for you. Alicia, if you can go ahead and advance your slides. Thank you. So a few introductions. Mimi Weber, she's our State Hazard Mitigation Officer for DR 4480. We have Marlene White, who's the Chief of Mitigation Programs here at DSHS. And Thad Lugamore, he is also part of the Hazard Mitigation Program team lead with the DR 4480. And then, of course, Beth Peck here again. Next slide, please. So we broke down our webinar today into six parts, make it a little easier to digest. This webinar is meant to be interactive. We are going to provide options and time for questions after each section to make sure that everybody's questions are heard and taken care of. If you do not have speaker capability or you just don't feel comfortable speaking up, we do have the Q&A option down in the lower right-hand corner. You can always type your questions into there and we'll be able to answer you as we can. Next slide, please. All right, so part one, just a little background information for everybody. Next slide, please. So key dates and deadlines. So we have what we've referred to as the NOFO. It's the Notice of Funding. That was released on January 12th. We held state webinars the week of January 18th, and we are currently wrapping up our regional webinars. Today is the last regional webinar that we're doing. The benefit cost analysis webinar, that will take place on February 16th. Most likely there will be additional BCA webinars. We are aware that BCA is usually the sticky wick when it comes to applications, and we want to make sure that we provide as much assistance as possible for that. Those links are not quite available yet, but we will make sure that those go on the website as soon as possible. Applications for this is due to us here at DSHS by April 1st, 5 p.m. on April 1st. And applications are due to FEMA on August 5th. If there's any changes to these dates, the April 1st and August 5th date, we'll be sure to let you know as soon as we have those. Next slide, please. So funding for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. You will sometimes hear it referred to as 404 mitigation. That simply just refers to where it sits in our Stafford Act. The grant program funding comes after the state receives a presidential declaration. The goal of this mitigation grant program is to support the long-term hazard mitigation measures that enhance resiliency and sustainability against natural hazards and their effects. We have here also the link to the HMA guidance. This is sort of our mitigation go-to for all of the FEMA requirements. Next slide, please. So money is available for projects that are up to $293 million under the DR 4480 and up to $22 million for planning. The priorities are to implement cost-effective mitigation projects, updates for multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans, as well as the planning enhancements and planning-related activities. Next slide, please. So eligible sub-applicants are encouraged to take advantage of all of our open funding opportunities. Those eligible sub-applicants include local governments, Indian tribal governments, as well as certain PMPs. Those PMPs need to perform a government-like function. You may have just put in for your FEMA, your BRIC and FMA 2020 or your BRIC FMA 2021. We are still encouraging you to also apply under this funding opportunity as well. Again, those applications are due to us by April 1st by 5 p.m. And while individuals, businesses, and NPOs are not eligible to apply, eligible sub-applicants may apply on behalf of those individuals. And the theming planning requirements must be met by all sub-applicants at the time of obligation and project approval. Next slide, please. All right. I'm going to now turn the webinar over to Thad. He's going to review some of the mitigation projects.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to provide an overview of the priorities and the ranking process and also the eligible projects. So for 4480, the three overarching ideas as far as priorities for these projects are: one, to provide relief to disadvantaged communities and socially vulnerable areas. And we'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about the Social Vulnerability Index and other metrics. To enhance resiliency postures by promoting strategies and activities as identified in the New York State Hazard Mitigation Plan, especially as it pertains to climate change, and also key on infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So again, a little more on the prioritization criteria. The state is looking for projects where work will be completed or that will benefit areas that are vulnerable communities or disadvantaged populations. This is in line with the federal government's Justice 40 initiative and, of course, the current administration's similar goals. Projects that address climate change adaptation and resilience with an eye towards the future and escalating risks associated with climate change. Those projects that go to protect and mitigate utilities, which are also known as critical lifelines, critical infrastructure, and repetitive loss structures. Those are structures that have suffered flood losses under the National Flood Insurance Program. And also projects that are specifically called out within your FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. Next slide, please. So this is the complete list of eligible projects under HMGP included in the hazard mitigation assistance, which is the Bible of this program with all of the other programs included. In the next slides, I'm going to go over those in detail that really pertain to New York. But here is the complete list with everything from wildfire to wind retrofit, etc. Next slide, please. So the first one that we're going to talk about is property acquisition and structure demolition. These are more commonly known as buyouts. This is where an owner or owners agree to voluntarily participate in a program where their flood-prone structure is purchased at fair market value and then demolished, with the land being converted back to green space and the deed being taken over by the purchasing municipality. Again, once it's purchased, any structures on that property will be torn down, and the property must be returned to green space in perpetuity, which means forever. Now, those properties can they do have some allowable uses after it's purchased. So if you had several properties, say along a river that you purchased, that could be turned into a park-like function. Certain things like pervious parking, community gardens, things like that would be eligible. But at its heart, you cannot put a insurable structure or anything that would impede the floodplain on that parcel once it's purchased. And certainly anything would require FEMA approval prior to putting it on those parcels. As many of you know, this program requires that projects meet the benefit cost analysis test. We're going to talk about that at length later. But for buyouts, the properties have this program has what we call a pre-calculated benefit. This is where FEMA has done some nationwide calculations to determine at what level is the average cost to purchase these homes. So based on that FEMA pre-calculated benefit, if the home is located within the special flood hazard area, formerly known as the 100-year floodplain, and I will refer to it as the 100-year floodplain to make it easy for this webinar. If it's located in that 100-year floodplain and can be purchased for $323,000 or less, it is automatically cost effective. And you can aggregate properties together, which means if you did, say, 10 properties, for example, you would have a total eligible cost of 3.23 million. And as long as the homes averaged out to that cost, even if some of them came in higher to purchase, that certainly would still be eligible. And I should also note that if you're considering buyout in a higher cost area, that local adjustments can be made to that average cost. We're not going to get into too much detail here. However, you would reach out to the team. We can help walk you through that. The home does not have to have been damaged in an event to qualify, as long as it's in the 100-year floodplain and it can be purchased for $323,000 or less. It's automatically eligible. I should say, however, though, if you have a flooding event that has where the home has been substantially damaged, and that's a FEMA NFIP term, that means it's sustained damages in excess of 50% of the fair market value of that property. In a riverine setting, does not apply to coastal, but in a riverine setting, if it's been flooded, it's substantially damaged, and it's in that 100-year floodplain, then it's automatically eligible for buyout, regardless of the purchase price. So again, that would apply to a recent flooding event. COVID probably did not have any flood damages associated with it, but I know that there has been smaller events since then where some homes may have been damaged to the point of substantial damage, which this may be a consideration for. Next slide, please. The next one is structural elevation, which is exactly what it sounds like, and the pictures tell you exactly what the purpose is. So you would take a home that is in that 100-year floodplain, which first floor elevation, otherwise known as the FFE, is below the current base flood elevation, or BFE. And again, that BFE is just another name for the 100-year flood level. So if that home is sitting too low in the floodplain with its mechanicals and first floor down at or below that BFE, that home can be elevated above BFE. And if your local floodplain ordinance requires that you add base flood elevation plus a foot or two above for any new construction, that's what we call freeboard, that would also be eligible. And I should point out that elevations also come with a pre-calculated benefit. If the property is located within the 100-year floodplain and can be elevated for $205,000 or less, it is automatically cost effective. You can do multiple properties and aggregate them. Again, if it works out to that average, you're good. And certainly if it's more than that, a benefit cost analysis can be utilized, but the pre-calculated benefits make it fairly easy if you can do the homes for that cost or less. And I should also say here that the home does not have to have been damaged in an event to qualify. As long as it's in that 100-year floodplain and can be elevated for $205,000 or less, it's going to be eligible. Next slide, please. Dry flood proofing is exactly what it sounds like. This is where you use approved techniques to render a structure impervious to floodwaters. Can be done by several different techniques, whether it be building a wall around it, some kind of impervious barrier over masonry. I know of one that was done in Vermont after Irene, where a library had flood dams that can be installed in windows and doors, be installed to keep the water out. It's anything that prevents the water from invading the envelope of that building, even if the building cannot be occupied during the event. So as long as it can be sealed up, go away, flood goes down, come back, and it's dry inside, that counts as dry flood proofing and is eligible. Although if you're looking at a residential structure, it can only be done for historic residential structures. It's not eligible for non-historic structures. Those must be either elevated or bought out or otherwise mitigated. Next slide, please. Generators and related equipment. Generators must have a BCA done, but there are pre-calculated benefits for healthcare facilities that we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, if you have a critical facility that lacks a generator or has an undersized generator, that can be eligible for the HMGP program. Critical facilities include, of course, police, fire, your EOC, Also, where you may dispatch and or refuel your storm and emergency vehicles, um, anything, lift stations, water pumping stations. These are considered critical facilities, and certainly, and in the wake of pandemic, with a more keen eye towards healthcare facilities. Um, Healthcare facilities do have a new pre-calculated benefit methodology. It's not as straightforward as a simple dollar amount as was buyout and elevation that I talked about. However, it's based on some math, but it's the number of beds, the functions of that facility, the distance to other facilities in the area. But if you can just put those metrics together, you can determine if it's got if it is cost effective using that simple calculation. Next slide, please. Flood risk reduction projects. And again, these come in sort of two flavors in the guidance, localized and non-localized. I'm not really going to get into the weeds of the difference between those two. Certainly you can read it here, and quite frankly, the application is the same for both. But at any rate, it's when you're going to take measures to mitigate flooding, and that's a pretty wide net to cast, right? So it's anything from levees, seawalls, new detention or retention or modifications there too. You could do channelization and um, access capacity channeling. So if you so if your stream channel is able to withstand, say, a 100-year flood, or maybe 50-year flood, but beyond that, it's going to flood the neighborhood. A bypass channel can be included. It now includes dams, the demolition, rehabilitation, construction of dams, weirs. Again, this must be cost effective, and a lot of very typical project, especially in the smaller communities around New York State and hilly areas and the like, are culverts. So this state, as with many others, have no shortage of undersized culverts that have been around for a long time, that may have failed or probably will fail in the next large event. They are prime for mitigation, and this is where we expect to see a large number of infrastructure projects come in. So I want to take a minute to sort of describe a culvert project that was done here in New York. So next slide, please. So again, nothing sort of big and fancy, but this is there's a lot of these around the state. And certainly they will typically qualify if they're way undersized. You can see this one on the left, a simple pipe, some oversized stone put around it, probably was silted in, probably way too small to carry the flow under current drainage manuals. It may have created debris dams. It may have backed up and caused damage to structures behind it. Overtop the road or road the road. These are common damages caused by these type of old culverts. The one on the right that was put in its place, obviously you can see that it's a box culvert with a hard bottom. It has built-in wing walls to channel the water in and out and also prevent debris damming. Basically, and it certainly has, by my eye, it has increased the flow to probably by 100%. At any rate, this is your garden variety culvert, and these are great ones to develop under the HMGP program. Next slide, please. Structural and non-structural retrofitting of key facilities and or utilities. So basically, this is whether it be a structural retrofit. You see that a lot, in wind mitigation, hurricane mitigation, where you're bracing the structure, maybe adding roof straps, better roof systems, beams, columns, bracing the foundations. Could be, in a flooding scenario, if it's high enough in elevation in the floodplain but needs bracing. Certainly could be a structural retrofit for flooding. But in the flooding world, you see a lot of non-structural retrofitting, which may include moving key functions of a facility out of the first floor up onto the second or third floor, elevating utilities, your utilities, your HVAC and the like onto platforms. But at its heart, this category is when you take an existing facility and identify a risk and take steps to harden it against that risk. It's not new construction, it's the retrofitting of an existing structure or facility. Next slide, please. So infrastructure retrofit, and when we say infrastructure here, we're talking typically about your horizontal construction, overhead, underground utility systems, roads, bridges, and so as part of that, soil stabilization is a big part of that. You may use riprap to armor the inside bank of a stream that curves next to a road, because when that stream gets going, it chews apart that road. You can actually use geotextile fabrics, and now with green solutions, you can also use natural vegetative buffers, bioswales, these kind of things to prevent damage to your horizontal construction. Roads, of course, which is a good segue into the next slide. Next slide, please. So you can see this project here, which comes to us from New Hampshire. This road had a bank that was just, went road to bank, just natural features, no mitigation there. A flash flooding event occurred with a very localized heavy downpour. That road became a river, and that river tore apart the road and the bank next to it. As you can see down the road there, certainly piled up into the right of way into people's property. You see to the right where the mitigation included a retaining wall, and then a defensible space between that road and that wall that probably includes maybe that's a bioswale, or it's got a pipe running down through it. But at any rate, in that type of event, the water now has a place to travel, and it's armored so that it will, hopefully in the future, not result in the amount of damage that you saw in that rain event. Next slide, please. Miscellaneous Other. So this is the category that FEMA has included. That's sort of the catch-all for your outside-the-box projects. We've got a lot of interest in fighting the effects of climate change, not just your typical type of hazards, flooding, coastal flooding, those kind of things, but certainly now we're facing more heat waves. Prolonged droughts, believe it or not, are predicted in the Northeast, and sea level rise, of course, is a big one. But think too back to Ida and its effects on New York City with actual, urban flash flooding to the extent that it's almost like fluvial flooding in the mountains going down streets, and unfortunately caused a lot of damage and tragically caused loss of life in that scenario. And those type of events are likely going to increase in frequency and severity. So this is the category which, if you have an outside the box idea, of course, we'd love to hear about it. Come to us with it, but this is sort of the catch-all of the program. Next slide, please. So I do want to touch a bit about nature-based solutions because they are eligible under this program. Typically, they're not going to be standalone projects. These, for example, FEMA is not going to pay you to plant a forest of trees to combat greenhouse gases. However, when you add on green elements or nature-based solutions to a mitigation project, it can really pay dividends in ancillary benefits. So I'll give you two examples from recent history. One coming to us from Massachusetts, the city of Fall River, which is Lizzie Borden's hometown, for those interested. Had a road that ran right down through the center of town, a boulevard actually, a very wide road, and it would get the drainage system would get overcharged. It would flood the streets and actually would continuously flood out an emergency room on that street. So to add drainage, they put basically, instead of just putting in catch basins with underground pipe, larger catch basins, larger underground pipe, they created a bioswale with natural with natural vegetation and some tree box catch basins. Underneath it, it has at its heart, it certainly has traditional drainage facilities. However, that bioswale also adds the benefit of filtering water to improve the discharge that goes into the environment, and adds recreational space there, and also reduces the heat island a bit, and just generally beautifies the area. Another one of note in an urban setting is in Hoboken, New Jersey. They recently completed a city, a small city park area at ground level. It's a green space. It has a catch basin that's actually a basketball court. But underneath it, at its heart, underground, is a very large cistern designed to catch excess flooding through rain events, etc., and then slowly discharge it back into the system when capacity goes down, so that it doesn't discharge into the river. So on top you have this nice green space that reduces the heat island effect. They've done studies to show how much it's increased the surrounding property value, adds all of that recreational use, does improve water quality. But at its heart, it is a very tried and true method of flooding mitigation underneath. So again, nature-based solutions as part of a larger typical traditional mitigation project are certainly eligible. Next slide, please. All right, so I know I went over a lot there, and I went over it pretty fast. Are there any questions?
There is one stat that just came up in the Q&A that I just want to read out loud to make sure that if someone didn't see it or may have the same question but missed it. So the question was, can you submit more than one application under this grant for multiple projects that may qualify, or applicants limited to one application? So the answer that I did to that is to make sure that I understood it. And Joe, if I did not understand your question correctly, my apologies, but it seems like you are asking if multiple projects can go under one application. If that is the question, each project needs its own application, but there are no limits to how many applications can be submitted by the sub-applicant.
And I will also add to that, there is no cap on the federal share, right? So yep. Beth is absolutely right. You could submit as many viable, feasible, cost-effective projects as you can come up with, and there's no cap on the federal share. Any other questions? All right, hearing none, we will move on to protecting the social vulnerable areas. Next slide, please. You can go forward 2. Thank you. Oh, so as I talked about—
Hold on just 1 second, Thad. Oh. Hey, Thad.
Yep.
One more question just popped up.
Sure.
Is there a specific definition of critical infrastructure that is being used for the criteria?
So if you go to the guidance, there is, so they do call out definite, what you would think of, right? Police, fire, critical to utilities, where vehicles are being, sort of dispatched from, et cetera, healthcare facilities, certainly. However, then the guidance always goes on to say, or others, that you can identify. So if you're, if what you're thinking is not a specifically identified thing, you tell us why it's critical, right? It's it's your town, it's your community, it's your facility, and it certainly could qualify as a critical facility. I'll give you an example. In Sumter, South Carolina, after Joaquin, there was a project for lightning arresters. It was actually an outside the box project on their downtown municipal building. The police weren't there, the fire weren't there. It's basically where their executives' offices were, and full disclosure, it was an old style down south Opry house, very neat historic structure. But when this thing would get hit by in any hurricane or event, the thing would get hit by lightning. Is he cutting
in and out for you guys, or is it just me? Just me.
He would this facility would get hit by lightning and short the whole place out. And despite it not necessarily falling under the category of critical facility as defined in the guidance, they made the case that in times of emergency, this is where the executives of the municipality gathered and did their thing, and therefore FEMA accepted it. So yes, there are some there's some pretty standard definitions, but you are also free to qualify something yourself as critical. Of course, FEMA is going to review it. It's got to pass the sniff test, right? But you tell us why it's critical. Any other questions as it relates to projects? All right, hearing none.
Nope, looks like that's it. Thanks, Dad.
All right, and if you do get other questions, certainly just go ahead and pop them in there. So to the next slide. So I want to talk a bit about protecting those vulnerable, underserved communities. So the Federal Executive Order 14008, otherwise known as Justice 40, is the Biden administration's directive to federal agencies to try to target 40% of their available federal funds, to benefit disadvantaged communities. So the local administration has the same goals. So as part of this grant, part of the review panel process will be to look at the social vulnerability of those communities. One way, and the application is designed this way, one way to look at this is through the Social Vulnerability Index, which is a CDC product that's out and available online. I'm going to go through that in detail in a moment. It's very binary. It's very easy to use. But that being said, we understand that it is not a end-all be-all, and certainly there are other ways of defining a community as being a disadvantaged or underserved community. Therefore, if it doesn't quite make it under the Social Vulnerability Index, then there's room to narrate it under other metrics, and certainly the New York's published equity ranking is another way. But in the next couple slides, I'm going to get into the Social Vulnerability Index and other methods that you'll need to address in the application. Next slide, please. So the Social Vulnerability Index, again, it's put out by the CDC. It's an interactive map, and it assigns rankings at the census tract level that I'll get into in a minute. But basically, at its heart, it was designed for emergency management to include all kinds of emergencies, from pandemics to natural disasters, and it's designed as a tool for locals to target, to plan, to know how to respond and recover from events in those areas. But again, that is one metric, that is one thing that we use, but it's not the only thing. We also look at disadvantaged communities, and this is also can be known as poor rural communities, where the median, basically at the heart of it, the median income is 80% or less than the national average. Or other metrics that you can describe regarding the area that you're doing your project or for which it will benefit, can be qualified under this method. And again, certainly New York has its own equity and justice ranking that can be used. But we start with the Social Vulnerability Index because, again, it's fairly easy to use. So I'm going to go into that in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So here you get into the HUD website where you find the SVI. Certainly you can Google it. You'll find it. The link is here when we really put these slides online. But if you can find your way there, it gives you the detail, the background on all of the data that's collected as part of the census and how it's used. But then what it does is it's comes out in the form of a map that you click on the interactive map button there. Next slide, please. And you can see it rates each county, and then again, if you drill in, you scroll down, as it were, to that county. As you get low enough, you'll see it break apart into the individual census tracts within that area. We didn't do that here just because it's then tough to see the sort of map as a whole and get a feel for it. But you could see that the overall ratings of at this level counties are going to fall into that dark blue, that teal, that sort of lighter green, and then more of that yellow. So the dark blue and the teal are the top, or worst two, I should say. So if the census tract is one of those dark two shades, then it qualifies as an SVI community. If, however, that's the overall rating. Each of the overall ratings is then broken down by 4 theme rankings, and those 4 different themes have to do with income, segregation, those kind of things. But and you can't see it here because you actually have to kind of scroll down when you open it. But let's say your county, in this case you see Albany County there, didn't quite make it as an SVI. It was in one of the lighter of 2 shades. Well, when you scroll down, you can see in the theme rankings that of those 4 theme rankings, it may have scored in that higher 2 shades in one or more of those theme rankings. Well, that is also would qualify. So as long as it's in the darkest 2 shades of that overall ranking or any one of those 4 theme rankings, it would qualify. And then each census tract actually has a PDF you can click on that sort of gives you a report of that census tract with each of the colorful graphs for each of those, the overall ranking, those 4 theme rankings. So again, the SVI index is sort of the first stop on the menu in the application of how to consider this as an SVI, as a socially vulnerable area or not. But then from there it says if you've answered no to these questions, then can it be qualified as having less than 80% of the median income. And okay, then if still no, then you tell us why the area where the project is or that it will serve has disadvantaged community aspects to it. So it gives you all the room that you need to do to sort of qualify that in the application. And I should say that it's not a prerequisite, right? It's if it does not still quite make it, it's still an eligible project. We still want it submitted. There, between planning and projects, there's $315 million available. We anticipate that, we want to do everything we can to see all of those dollars get spent in the state, because it is only New York State that's eligible for those dollars. And if we don't spend it, it goes back to the federal government. So, again, we want to target and we want to show that we are serving those type of disadvantaged communities. But at the end of the day, we want to have enough projects to spend all that money. So, all comers welcome. Next slide, please. So at this point, are there any questions on assisting and protecting disadvantaged communities?
And Alicia, if you can unmute everybody so they have the ability to unmute themselves and speak up if they don't.
Location, if it's still within their facility?
I thought they put the air conditioner in a different building.
So unless you have a question, if you don't mind keeping yourself muted.
That's super. Can you mute yourself, please?
It's not emergency protective measures, it's temporary relocation.
Are you able to mute?
Okay. See the one up here, 2, 3 above? Right there.
All right. So do I hear any questions on either projects or the SVI index?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
That as well.
My name is David Reed, and I have like a out of the box project that's in a vulnerable area.
Hold on, we're getting some feedback. Can you hold on one second?
They're not purchasing land or building.
Sure.
Yes.
All right, sorry about that. We're trying to, we're having some background.
That was with just debris. At 8.
Sorry.
That involved the temporary staging of equipment. Road access.
I think somehow you guys unmuted everybody, so you might have to mute everybody again.
All right, sorry about that. We're fixing the background. There we go. Okay. Thank you. All right, can you ask your question again? I apologize.
Can you hear me good now?
Yep.
Okay, so I have like an out of the box type of project that I wanted to ask about. So we do a project. Still hear background noise. Can you still hear me? You can still hear me with the background noise?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I have like a Wi-Fi project where I manage free Wi-Fi for the New York City Housing Authority
Okay.
in an area that the equipment is located in is not very great because of rodents and humidity that's caused by the boilers that create the heat and hot water. And I wanted to know what a project with a project like that where I would want to relocate the equipment, would I be able to have a chance to use any of this type of money?
Well, so I would definitely qualify that as an outside the box idea, right?
Yeah.
It's the hazards you're facing may not necessarily be natural hazards, but I'd want you to reach out to us, individually offline, so we can help you flush that one out, right? It's not a simple culvert, right? It's fairly different. But yeah, I don't want to categorically say no. It sounds like it would be a tough one, but we certainly can flush it out with you and see, what we could come up with. So we're going to get to a time in the presentation where we go over the contact and the contact email that you can reach out to us by. So if you hang on and get that information, reach out to us after this webinar, we can certainly talk it through with you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, do I have any other questions? All right, why don't we go ahead and hit the mute again, and then I'm going to pass it back to Beth.
Alicia, are you able to mute everybody again?
All right, I think we're good, Beth.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. All right, Alicia, you can go ahead and advance to the mitigation planning for me, please. One more slide. Thank you so much. So for DR 4480, we have 3 planning priorities. Those are, just go back one more for me, Alicia, please. Thank you. So the 3 planning priorities are the formal county hazard mitigation plan update, the enhanced planning and planning related activities. We have sub-application types within the planning application. The formal hazard mitigation plan update will be noted as the HMP. In regard to the application, so there are some priorities that are the counties which are currently without their approved hazard mitigation plan or without grant funding. Also, communities or counties rather that are anticipating grant funding currently in place for the development, or if a county plan will expire prior to those of other sub-applicants. Also, you can see here the funding cap is based off population, but keep in mind that funding may be prorated based on available funds, but not exceed the established planning limits. Next slide, please. Mitigation plan enhancements. You will notice that this is the HMPE sub-application type. These enhancements support planning work, which is linked to the significant impact of climate change across the state of New York, identifying risks, response activities, and prioritizing hazard mitigation projects. This is done through, incorporating those nature-based solutions, those smart growth principles, risk and vulnerability assessments that enhance your mitigation strategies within public health emergencies, as well as expansion of that planning partners, pulling in, those faith-based communities, public housing, etc. Next slide, please. This enhancement also includes incorporating those underserved populations that Thad was talking about a little earlier, incorporating them into that planning process, as well as integrating mitigation into that flood management. Works to help gain some credit under your NFIP or if you're a CRS community. There is also that funding cap for the planning enhancements based off population. Next slide, please. So the third mitigation planning is the HMPA. This is planning related activities. Keep in mind that these are not formal updates, but enhancing the current FEMA approved mitigation plan. The intent for planning related activity would be to integrate information from current approved mitigation plans related to risk assessment or mitigation strategies with other planning efforts. Next slide, please. Some additional planning resources to help develop your hazard mitigation plans are here on this slide. The New York State Hazard Mitigation Planning Standards is a requirement above and beyond the FEMA mitigation requirements. Those resources are here. Again, this slide deck will be available on our website so you can reference back. Next slide, please. Are there any questions regarding the planning applications? I do see that there is one question. Is there any update on whether or how we can submit advanced assistance sub-applications?
Yes, thanks. So I'll take that one. At this time, we actually have we're trying to schedule a call with FEMA to discuss, but right now at this point, we are not, the state is not offering advance assistance.
Thanks. That was my question. Do you have a time frame for when? I guess this is Yael Levine from New York City Emergency Management. So we coordinate with New York City agencies on scoping projects and submitting sub applications. So we definitely have some project ideas which could result in potential A sub application. So I guess we're just trying to understand, like, we obviously don't want, if that is available, then we would like to take advantage of that, but want to make sure that we're prepared to do that. So do you have any sense of like time frame for when more guidance might become available, or alternatively, if folks should potentially prepare using the planning sub application as a reference?
Yeah, so we actually reached out yesterday. We had gotten a sort of email response back, and again, I know that advanced assistance was something that you guys and down in the area there was done under Sandy as a pilot program, but we are again, we've requested a call with FEMA Region 2 to sort of get some more detail on exactly what the deliverable outcome has to be in order to qualify as having created a viable HMGP application is the requirement. So without more guidance and without more definitive answers from FEMA, we're hesitant to give out more, to make it available or to give out more guidance to you. But that said, again, as recent as today, we asked for a call to be scheduled in this week if possible, so that we can get more concrete guidance. Because again, I know it was definitely done as a pilot to some success after Sandy, but since then, now that it's in the application as a full-blown category, there's some confusion over what and when the outcome of that must be in order for it to qualify as having met the requirements so that you can keep the money, right? So again, I apologize that I don't have a better answer for you than that, other than to assure you that we, and specifically Mimi, is working hard to get a better understanding of how we could make it available and how effective it could be so that we can get an answer out quickly.
Thanks. Definitely appreciate you guys talking to FEMA about that, and I guess we'll see if there's any positive outcome, which would be great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you, but you know, we like I said, we're definitely working it, and we're being cautious, just because there's so much unknown with it, and we don't want anyone to, you know, either bank on it or, you know, fail to meet the criteria and then fail to keep the money, which nobody wants to give money back, right? So, all right, back to you,
Oh,
Beth.
perfect. Thank you. Alicia, if you can advance one more for me, please. So applications for the DR 4480, it's a little different, especially if you're coming straight from the BRIC FMA application submission. These applications for this is going to be submitted directly here to DISHUS. There is a new link. Our website was under construction over the course of this week. The screenshot here is what the website looks like currently for the 4480 grant program funding. That is the most current link. You will find here both the planning application as well as your project application packages, as well as other documentations and resources that you'll need to help support that application development. Next slide, please. Just wanted to show a side-by-side of the planning application versus your project application. The circle there on your left-hand side reflects those sub-application types within the planning application. We strongly encourage you to review the applications as soon as possible. This will help ensure that you have necessary information in order to complete or any information that you need to gather prior to the development of your application. Next slide, please. Some of the best practices that we pulled together is to review the notice of the funding of opportunity, that NOFO, again, that's on our website. This will help ensure that that project or planning is in support of that, of their priorities. We also want to make sure that we have a detailed scope of work that provides the base for the intended project or plan, setting the groundwork for your why, providing relevant and supporting documentation, again, to support that scope of work, engineering studies, historical documentation, maps, photos, anything that supports what you are looking to do to help us help you get to the yes of this project. Clear and consistent naming provides support to ensure that documentation is not lost, to have that application be one whole holistic unit, as well as providing, it increases the application review, so we're not hunting for anything. Next slide, please. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please, Alicia. Thank you. Allowable cost. Oh, back one more. Thank you. So allowable costs, pre-award costs are those that the sub-applicant has incurred prior to the sub-application submission. These costs must be identified within the application as an individual line item within the cost estimate. Sub-applicants who are awarded funding are also eligible for reimbursement of up to 5% of the total project award for management costs. Next slide, please. The cost share for the HMGP program, whether you are putting in a planning application or a project application, is a 75-25. 75% is the federal share, and it is reimbursable of eligible costs. That remaining 25% is considered non-federal match and is the responsibility of the applicant. That non-federal match can be consist of cash or donated and in-kind services, materials, or a combination of all of them. Keep in mind, though, that for this funding opportunity, federal funds cannot be used towards the non-federal match. Any questions before I turn it back over to Thad? All right. back to you,
All right,
Brad.
thank you, Beth. So now we are going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, the benefit cost analysis. This is by no means a benefit cost analysis training. We do have a specific benefit cost analysis training or webinar, I should say, coming up that will get into much more detail into the BCA. But you know, the two things that I want to stress here are sort of the importance of the BCA and what goes into it. That because it is usually the critical path with these mitigation projects. And also, besides the webinar, we have a team assembled here at Dishes to work with locals to develop their BCAs and help them through that process, because it can be very technical, especially if you're trying to do it on your own for the first time, right? So, but at its heart, these programs require that the mitigation project you're looking to do be cost beneficial. And what does that mean specifically? So basically, I'm going to use the example of a culvert that has a 50-year functional lifespan. If you wanted to put in upgrade an undersized culvert, let's say that culvert's 40 years old and it's been known to wash out and it's been known to cause damage to structures near it. You would want to, and you want to put in your 50-year culvert. Well, basically what FEMA wants to know is that the damage that you will avoid over the life of that culvert, again, if you were to leave the old one in, what damages would you avoid? And are those damages that you avoided by mitigating it greater than the cost of doing your mitigation? And again, that is what it is at the heart of it. The software does the work for you. Can be complex, but in principle, that is what the benefit cost analysis is doing. It's going to figure out what the average annual damage on any structure, or again, being caused by any structure is. And if that average annual damage times 50, with escalation factors, et cetera, but if that annual damage times 50 is greater than the cost of your 50-year culvert, then it's got a benefit cost ratio of 1 or greater. It's considered cost effective. Now, again, anybody can go to the FEMA website. You can Google FEMA BCA Toolkit. You'll get this version 6.0 benefit cost calculator. It's basically a spreadsheet button add-on. If for those of you who worked in the older software versions of 5.3 and older, it is a lot more user-friendly. However, again, it is required, and it is what I like to call a garbage in, garbage out type of program. Anybody can go in it and play with the numbers and make anything look cost effective. But the problem is that those inputs that you put into the benefit cost analysis must be backed up with data and proof, because they will be looked at and they will be picked apart by FEMA. So in my experience, if you're considering a project that you want to move forward with, a good idea is to at least run an initial back of the envelope, or back of the napkin, depending where you are, as we call it, BCA, to kind of see in the ballpark of what the avoided damages would be. So let's go back to that 50-year culvert I was talking about. That something needs to be done there. That you want to maybe increase it to the 100-year level. So what you do first would be to go and take that software and input your past damages to see what kind of B benefit it generates. So you go in there, you do that, and you put in a dummy project cost, but you're really just trying to figure out what the B in your BCA is, because that actually could be your budget. It's a good, easy way to remember it. It says, hey, you're going to avoid $1 million in damage, over 50 years if you mitigate this thing. Well, then, that engineer might say, okay, well, I could definitely do a culvert there for less than $1 million. Let's go forward. What we really caution applicants against is getting too far down the road, with design and drawings and all of those expenses to do the BCA last as an afterthought, and find out that it may not be cost effective, or you try to manipulate the software to make it cost effective. The software is neutral. It totally depends on the user inputs. So in the next few slides, I'm gonna talk about that a little more detail. Next slide, please. So again, going back to what do you need to input into your benefit cost analysis? One would be the cost of the project. Again, if you're doing your initial BCA, you're just trying to get going to see if you got something here. You could use a ballpark price. It's you're going to refine that later, but you would need to know what's the useful life of the project that you're looking to do, right? So is that's the 50-year culvert we're talking about. So the useful life of what you're looking at is 50 years. The maintenance cost once that thing's installed. So it might be minimal. You might just have to pay, 2 guys in a truck once a year to go out there, clean it out, hose it out, make sure there's no debris, whatever. But you have to have maintenance costs associated with everything except for buyouts, because again, buyouts can go back to green space, and there is no necessarily maintenance required. The age of the structure that you're mitigating, right? So if you're replacing, let's say, an old steel pipe culvert, and you have a pretty good idea that that thing is 40 years old, then that's your look back period. That's your analysis period, right? You're going to look at the damages incurred there for the last 40 years. The location of a project, that's the straightforward. Historical damages. So you need to know, again, if we're using what we call DFA, depth function analysis, which is basically using past damages as your to predict your future damage. You're going to want to have 3 or more past damage events. They don't necessarily all have to be huge. If they were involved in the FEMA public assistance in any way, that's a great source. But you want to have at least 3. And if you have full cost data, that is, that's great. That's the ultimate. But if you have older events and you can just prove that something happened there, either through pictures or maybe there's newspaper clippings or meeting minutes. But you want to document that there's been damage there 3 times. If it's been less than 3 times, you can still use those damages, but then you have to know what the known recurrence interval for those events was. And what a recurrence interval means is, hey, what level of storm was it? So you might have a culvert that got damaged or washed out in Floyd, and then much later by Irene. Well, those storms would be pretty easy to find out what was that was say, 100-year storm or a 75-year storm. Whatever the case may be, that year they're talking about that you can find on USGS or NOAA, and the other sources, that is what's known as the recurrence interval. And it's got to be documented, through a source. It can't just be a ballpark. And then you need to know what's the expected level of protection that that this thing is going to offer after mitigation. So again, I go back to the culvert we're talking about that is designed to pass a 100-year storm. That's the LOP, or level of protection. For expected damages, again, this is, we're going to have a BCA webinar that goes into far more detail. But like to say, you might have a culvert in a 100-year floodplain that's never experienced a 100-year flood, right? Or it's maybe not had any really serious events, but it's still up to up to its potential. But it does not mean it's not going to happen. So again, that's a little more tricky, more science required in that BCA, but it is possible to predict the damage there through science if no losses have occurred or no measurable events have yet occurred there. So you need to know what those expected damages would be before and after mitigation. And then other documentation to justify non-typical inputs or assumptions. So for example, if your culvert that you're going to put in wasn't a 30 or a 50 year, which are typical culverts, you're going to say this thing's a 150-year culvert. Well, you would need to provide manufacturer specs or engineering, something to prove or to be convincing to show that functional lifespan is actually that long. Next slide, please. So how do you make your BCA? What are some of the best practices? Well, you want to have a detailed narrative, for this and for the project in general, right? You need to narrate what is the risk you're trying to mitigate and how will this project do it. You want to add as much detail as you can. You have to consider 3 project alternatives for that location. So you have to discuss what other considerations you made and a ballpark cost for those. So one of the easy ones always to do is you considered no action, which probably is not a desirable is not a desirable course of action to take no action. The other might be you looked at, again, to pass our 100-year storm, and I'm not saying this is permittable, but let's say just you could do it by laying 3 pipes next to each other, gets you to your capacity you need. Probably not a good alternative because it's going to be a debris dam and a lot of other reasons. You want to go with an open bottom arch or perhaps a box culvert like we showed in that picture. Well, you would put those 3 alternatives in and then describe why the other 2 were undesirable and why you're going with the one that you are. Least cost alternative is not the end all be all. Again, that other one might cause debris damming. You would describe why it's not the correct best way to go. But however, cost does come into play. Certainly, they're not going to let you put anything ornamental, or gilded on your culvert. But cost alternative is not the end all be all. It's what makes the most sense for that location. Impacts from historical events, and you got to talk about those historical events, describe what happened there in those historical events, or again, a description of the expected damages. Hey, we have not had a 100-year storm, or we have not had a 50-year storm, but this is what we expect. My engineer expects to happen if in fact you have that level of event. The next thing is, again, providing all the supporting documentation, engineering plans, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100%, stamped and ready to go permitted plans. Back to our simple culvert, it might be that the engineer does a, sort of a preliminary rendering with a description of what it's going to be, and that's enough. But you need something to plan around, and if it's a larger, more complex project, you're probably going to get into more detailed engineering that's needed to be able to demonstrate that this thing is both, going to provide the level of protection, but also that it's feasible, and you have enough there to base your budget on. Studies such as H&H studies are usually required when you're talking about doing things in a drainage area. Maps, it's pretty straightforward, and photos, picture says 1,000 words. Next slide, please. So what are some of the common pitfalls we see when looking at benefit cost analysis? One is the lack of supporting documentation for historical damages. This one is big, right? The BCA requires that you input some past damages. You can't just ballpark it. You can't ballpark the year. You can't ballpark the damage. You have to provide backup to show that these events occurred and when they occurred, and other inputs as well. Recurrence interval being one of them. You can't just ballpark what level of storm something was. You have to document it through either USGS, NOAA, or whatever. Give you a quick example. We looked at a culvert project that came in recently, an application with a benefit cost analysis. The area had suffered, this was a drainage area, had suffered some damage from Fred, to the tune of around $75,000, I believe. But when that damage was input into the software, the recurrence interval was listed as 1. Now, I'm not sure what Fred was in that area, but it certainly was a higher than a 1-year recurrence interval, because what you're doing there is you're telling the software that that level of damage is going to happen every year. And then the software is going to take and compound that with interest right over that 50 years. That's not the proper input. Now, again, I don't think that was malicious, just probably someone new to the software, not understanding it. However, if you make those kind of adjustments in there that are not backed up by documentation, they will be looked at and they will be changed, and it could kill your BCA. So you want to make sure you got the documentation to back up your inputs. Another big one is after mitigation damages are not included in the application. So as I said earlier, the only mitigation that has no after mitigation maintenance or damages after you mitigate it are buyouts, because it's green space and you're done. However, every other structure that you do, let's go back to our culvert that's going to provide protection to the 100-year level. Well, then perhaps at the 120-year level, it's going to start to show some damage. The road's going to get overtopped, whatever the case may be. But at some point, Mother Nature is going, can overwhelm even our best efforts. So at that level, you would need to start to reintroduce some, modicum of damage. Now, the software is not going to it's not going to be weighted too much because it only occurs once every 120 years, so it's not going to amount to much. But you do have to address that at some point, damage can be reintroduced to that structure. It's unclear if the project is standalone, so these projects must provide the level of protection and prevent the damage, the B and the BCA on its own. So use the example, of a levee. If you have homes, and you want to build a levee and it's got homes, behind it that you're going to protect, but there's no evidence that it can work on its own without having, more levees connected to it or other drainage, then it cannot count. You cannot count those damages in your benefit cost analysis if it's going to rely on other unattached projects to be effective. It must be a standalone solution. And then finally, lack of documentation for your upstream and downstream impacts. So when you're working in the stream channel, in the drainage areas, these natural drainage areas, you're going to have to provide a study that shows what's going to happen to the floodplain after you do your mitigation. Are you going to pass your problems downstream? You can't pass your problems downstream. But at any rate, you probably aren't, but you still have to have your H&H that shows that. So, and we need that to send that to FEMA. Next slide, please. So again, I know that I went over that pretty quick, and we are going to have, BCA webinars with more BCA experts on it, and we'll probably do several of them. But with that said, are there any questions regarding the benefit cost analysis?
Okay.
All right, then I'll pass it back to you, Beth. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Alicia, can you advance the slides for me, please? Thank you so much. So when it comes to the application review process for 4480, it's a slightly different. Again, if you've just come off your BRIC and FMA applications, the applications are submitted directly to us here at DISHIS, and they'll be reviewed on a first-come basis. So to touch on that a little bit, the applications are due on April 1st, but any work that we do as the application development team or the technical assistance team with you on your application prior to that is considered technical assistance. It is not considered your official submittal of your application. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're wary about submitting it, especially if it's not completed. We are here to help you work on your application and ensure that it is a solid application. We anticipate any requests for information, the RFIs, will be back to the sub-applicant by May 6th. There's no extensions or exceptions with this time frame for that. Sub-applicants will have 10 business days or until May 20th to complete and return those RFIs to DISHIS. Once we review the completed applications, we will make sure that those eligible projects are sent over to our review panel for their review, scoring, and priority ranking. And then those eligible applications that are ranked based off the review panel's scoring will be sent to FEMA by August 5th. Again, if there's any changes to these dates, we will reach out and let you all know as soon as possible that there are some extensions in the application submittal. But again, for sake of planning, still plan on that April 1st deadline. Next slide, please. So some dates to keep in mind, again, the January 25th to February 3rd, that's our regional webinars. This is the last regional webinar. The February 16th date is our date that we are scheduled for the BCA informative webinar. Again, there may be some additional BCA information out there that we're going to provide, or webinars rather, that we're going to provide. Again, that April 1st date, applications are due to DISHIS. May 6th, those RFIs will be sent back to the applicants, and May 20th, those will be returned to us here. And then that August 5th date, again, we will be submitting the top ranked eligible applications to FEMA. That again is our link to our website directly to the 4480 grant program funding opportunities. Next slide, please. This is just our cadence that we're doing with the HMGP. Again, you know that January 12th, the NOFO, that was the kickoff for our webinar series, both the statewide and regional. Also the official kickoff of the application and development and technical assistance. We are accepting applications now. If you have an application ready to go, please get that ready and send it out to us. I'll provide the email and a phone number in just a few minutes. April 1st, again, as those applications are due. That's the formal review that starts that day. Those will include site visits, benefit cost analysis, and RFIs. That will also be after that, we'll submit those to the review board and the applications will be prioritized. And then August 5th is that FEMA submittal date where they begin their review process. Again, that website there, the link, that will bring you directly to our website where the information, the project and planning applications are available. Once we have the webinar, BCA webinar ready and available, that will also be at that link. That is our email, the HMGP4480 at dhses.ny.gov. Next slide, please. Again, the technical assistance that we have ready for you, it's to help with your application development, assistance with the benefit cost analysis. Even if you just want to kind of run by a thought or a possible project with us, we are here to help and assist you with that. Many of us are very familiar with the whole mitigation grant program process, but there's also many of us that are not. So we're here to kind of help alleviate some of that stress for you and work with you to help get to that yes. If you need to reach us, our number is 518-242-5219. Again, our email is hmgp4480 at dhses.ny.gov. And again, that is the link to bring you to our website. And these slides, again, will be up on our website. Kind of redundant if you're already there with that link, but this will help link you to any of the information that you need to gather. Next slide, please. We went over quite a bit of information for all of you. So we wanted to make sure that you had those resources and information at your fingertips as well. So here are some of the websites that we utilize to gather that information, all kind of in one spot for you that you can use to help with your mitigation application development and additional resources. Next slide. So that's all we have, but definitely open to questions. We can unmute the lines if everybody would like to provide some additional questions. Oh, I do see that we have a few. So Lisa is asking, how would the BCA be calculated for a generator for a municipal building?
Great, thank you. So, you know, the municipal building has to be a critical facility. You know, that's the first sort of hurdle. Not that it's a hurdle, but again, it has to be that you're doing emergency functions from that structure. You know, it's not just your typical office building, right? So just have to say that, but provided it is, you know, you can qualify it as providing critical services in time of emergency, then there are worksheets depending on the type of critical facility you're looking at, police, fire, et cetera, that our BCA staff can help you with, right? So it depends on the facility and what the function is, but it's a fairly prescribed methodology that FEMA has for calculating benefit cost analysis. You know, we would ask you to reach out to us, directly, and we can certainly walk you through that.
There's also a follow-up. Will DISHES be providing BCA services for all sub-applicants?
Well, let me just make sure we agree on what providing DCA services means. So DISHIS is providing technical assistance with helping applicants input a benefit cost analysis, right? Ultimately, it's the applicant's responsibility to download it and take the first pass at getting those inputs in there and providing the backup documentation. Our staff, the DISHIS staff, will then help those applicants get through that, review it and provide suggestions and changes and technical assistance. Certainly in the beginning, if you need help with finding it and downloading, we can help you with that. And finally, we are also looking at scheduling a BCA formal sort of training on, here's how you physically, use it. Although again, like I said, it's pretty intuitive. So yes, we are standing by to help with technical assistance, everyone to, develop their benefit cost analysis, but ultimately it's the applicant's responsibility to create the initial BCA. Any other questions? All right, Beth, back to you. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for joining our webinar. If there are no other questions, you are free to go. Otherwise, you could always reach out to us. Again, that phone number is 518-242-5219. And our email is the hmgp4480@dhses.ny.gov. Sometimes you get off a webinar and you think, oh, I should have asked that question. Shoot it on over to that email or give us a call. And if you guys are all set, you are free to go. Enjoy your night, stay safe, and have a great day.